I'm Fritz Mayer. I'm the Dean of the Korbel School of International Studies here at the University of Denver, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the ICAP conversation on seeking domestic and international equity and the impact of climate change policy. First, for any of you in the audience who don't know about ICAP, the International Career Advancement Program, it just celebrated its 25th anniversary, now I guess in its 26th year. And over that period, more than 700, it has more than 700 alumni, primarily persons of color who've been through its programs held annually in Aspen, Colorado. Its alumni are really a who's who in international affairs. It's really quite impressive. ICAP was started by and is still directed by my colleague and my predecessor as dean here at the Korbel School, Tom Rowe. And we are just so proud at Korbel to be the host institution of this remarkable program. Now, today's topic could hardly be more timely or important. Climate change is now not a distant and abstract possibility. It's an immediate and stark reality. And we're just at the beginning. It is, of course, a scientific issue and an economic issue and a technological issue and a political issue, but it is also, and importantly, a moral issue. Climate change will have and is already having disproportionate effects on the poor and most marginalized nations and persons within nations, the very people who are also least culpable. So today's conversation is about whether and how the global community and the United States can rise to that challenge. And with me, joining me is just a stellar panel. So let me introduce our panelists, and then we will have a conversation amongst ourselves a little bit. But we really welcome questions from all of you in the audience. So put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will get to as many of them as we can. Let me start with Sundaa Bridgett-Jones, who was an ICAP alum from 2002. She is the Chief Partnership and Advocacy Officer for the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, which is a new enterprise to accelerate and scale equitable energy transitions in low and middle income countries. There she leads a partnership spearheaded by the Rockefeller Foundation, the IKEA Foundation, and the Bezos Earth Fund. And Sundaa brings more than 25 years of experience designing and executing high-impact global initiatives as the Managing Director for Policy and Coalitions at the Rockefeller Foundation, leading the Office of Policy Planning and Public Diplomacy at the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, managing C-suite affairs at the United Nations Department of Political Affairs, leading government initiatives at the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. She holds a master's degree in public and international affairs from the University of Pittsburgh and a bachelor's degree in international affairs and African studies from Georgetown University. Welcome, Sundaa.
Thanks so much, Fritz. Thank you.
Lisa Reyes Mason is associate professor at the University of Denver's Graduate School of Social Work. She describes herself as a social worker, scholar, and advocate for climate justice who finds purpose and passion in engaging social work, a profession in pursuit of health, equity, and social justice, in confronting the climate crisis to create a thriving and regenerative world for all. At the University of Denver, Mason co-created the Masters in Social Work concentration in ecological justice, which I believe is the first of its kind in the United States. Among her publications, she's co-editor of People and Climate Change, Vulnerability, Adaptation, and Social Justice, which is a collection of lived experiences and case studies of climate injustice from the global South and North. Lisa serves the city and county of Denver as a member of its Sustainability Advisory Council. She's also a returned Peace Corps volunteer, having served in Guinea, West Africa. Lisa received her MSW and PhD from Washington University in St. Louis and as a BA from the University of Pennsylvania, where she majored in folklore and folk life. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you, Fritz.
Hi, Nima. Good to see you. So let me introduce Nima Patel Edwards, who was ICAP 2003, a year after Sunday. Nima is the director of ESG Climate Advisory at KPMG. She has more than 20 years of performance audit and program management experience in the federal government. At FEMA, Nima led a major study on flood insurance affordability and served on working groups for FEMA's White House initiatives on resilience and disasters for at-risk populations. At the GAO, Nima led post-Katrina evaluations of the National Flood Insurance Program, as well as U.S.-funded anti-corruption programs in sub-Saharan Africa, emerging market bank supervision, international assistance to Russia, and international efforts to provide debt relief to developing countries. Nima also has extensive international development experience in Kenya, Rwanda, Southern Sudan, and the Balkans in her work with Catholic Relief Services and the International Rescue Committee. She received a master's in international affairs from the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, a fine school, and a BA degree from the University of Pittsburgh. So welcome, Nima.
Thank you very much.
And last but not least, Frank Laird is my colleague here at the Korbel School, where he currently serves as the interim senior associate dean for faculty and research. We work closely together, but it's fun to have a conversation about substance and not administrative matters today. Frank teaches in the fields of public policy making, energy policy, and environmental policy, especially climate policy. His research and publishing focus on energy policy, the linkage between energy policy and climate change, the role of science in making public policy, and the role of government funding of scientific research and development. Frank has a BA in physics from Middlebury College, a PhD in political science from MIT, and did postdoctoral work in environmental policy at Harvard University. So welcome, Frank.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So, Nima, let me start with you. You have certainly a lot of experience working in the developing world and thinking about the impacts of climate change. So maybe you could get us started by helping us understand how is and will climate change disproportionately impact poorer people and poorer nations?
Yeah, thank you for that question. This is something that I really have been focused on in the last several months in my job at KPMG, something we're thinking about in terms of environmental and climate justice. So let me take this as a two-tier approach. One is for what will happen domestically, and then some thoughts on the international arena. So we have this sort of landscape that's occurring with climate change since the 1980s, right? In the 1980s, there were $3 billion storms that occurred. And in 2022, there were 18. And over the last 3 years, there were on average, 20 per year over the last 3 years. And since 1980, it's been 2.4 trillion in losses. And those are just the billion-dollar storms that are happening, right? And those storms are not just storms or events, right? We're talking about, coastal riverine flooding, wildfires, winter storms, tornadoes, hurricanes, of course. And then we have heat events, which are the sort of the new peril that's emerged, as you see in the West quite a bit, right? So heat events have been pretty significant. And so the 2022 disaster amounts are sort of 165 billion. And the costliest last year was Hurricane Ian, but the second costliest was the Western and Central drought. So you have that sort of happening across the US. The EPA just put out a study looking at this issue, and they found that for Black and African Americans, they're 40% more likely to live in areas with increased mortality due to climate-driven events. For Hispanic and Latino and Native Americans and Alaska Native individuals, you see that 43% of them live in the highest areas where they're projected to lose labor, right? Labor hours due to climate. And then for Asians, they're more likely to live for Hispanics and Latin American, Latinos and Native Americans, it's 43%. And for Asians, it's 23% more likely to live in a coastal area to be affected by coastal storms. So this disproportionately impacts, right? And there's there's just the climate issue is one part of the issue. The other part is sort of the pollution issue, and that's sort of, it's been an emerging issue over the last few years, but I can get to that in my later comments. But I wanted to just talk about this. We know that this is significant. We know that the problem is real. We know the Biden administration put out the Justice 40 initiative, really focusing on communities that have been disproportionately impacted by pollution and by climate, and they want federal funding to be directed in that area. That is a big change, and that has been codified in the Inflation Reduction Act, which is this oddly named, pretty mega superpower bill that will, probably serve to change the nature of climate and energy in this country. And there's about $40 billion in it for environmental justice. So this is exciting news. So I'd like to talk about, what's happening and how bad it is. There's a little bit of sort of a balancing that's occurring currently in that area. So for developing countries, when I started looking at this, it's really interesting for the global world, right? Not just developing countries, but in the world, you start looking at the climate events that are occurring, and they usually focus on insurance losses, right? And so we start talking about those losses. We talk about Ian and the European drought. We're talking about what happened, flooding in China and drought, of course, what happened in Pakistan, but they're really focused on losses due to insurance and reinsurance. But what we see when we talk about the impacts on people, it's a different story, right? The story, flooding in West Africa, the cyclone in Bangladesh, those flooding in Malaysia and Brazil, storms in Southeast Asia, those things, and the heat wave in the Arctic and Antarctic, those things tend to sort of rise to the top. So we're really, how we think about this needs to shift. And in the global, and we see this, in developing countries, the impacts they're already here, right? We're already facing this. But we see sort of the increase in price of food due to lower production. Heat is a significant issue, and heat-borne illnesses, lower earnings, it impacts education, right? Impacts children, impacts children's health. There's just a cycle that occurs with this. And then just, of course, the higher risk of death. So there is a significant move in that degree. Let's say the 1.5 degree target is something that we'll most likely miss. And the adaptation is sort of needs to be starting now, if it hasn't already. And there's a little bit of hope on that end too. There's the last COP27, the Prime Minister of Barbados put forth an initiative called the Bridgett-Jones Initiative. That changed the thinking there was that what's happening in the Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank and IMF, is not sufficient. The inability for developing countries, especially island nations, to be able to borrow money at comparable rates to developed countries it's not fair, and they're supposed to try to adapt to significant climate impacts, and they can't. They don't have the resources, and they need them. So loss and damage has become a big issue, and it's taking hold.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll have a chance to come back to the COP and efforts to address this. But that's really helpful, I think, in setting the stage with the picture of these major impacts happening. Even the environmental impacts are concentrated often in poorer areas of the world, and then, as you say, the ability to adapt is so much less than in the wealthier nations. So, thank you for setting the stage. Let me turn to you, Sundaa. You're involved with a variety of stakeholders who are at least trying to make some headway, I think, on these issues. And so I guess the question to you is how can and should the international community, whether nations, businesses, or NGOs, assist low and middle income countries in navigating this, what is really an energy transition? And we're asking them to have a less fossil fuel intensive development path, but at the same time, that's a really tough thing to do if you're trying to develop economically, right?
Indeed, it is, Fritz, and I appreciate how Nima laid out kind of some of the broader challenges that we have. And I guess let me say that the work that I do at the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet is focused on that nexus area of climate and energy, or at least it's kind of one and the same. And it's an interesting kind of vantage point to look at. when we think about it. And the biggest challenge here is really trying to address not only this transition, of hopefully trying to scout out a clean energy path for low middle income countries, but also addressing the energy poverty that we see, and just getting to the point that you had mentioned in terms of equity. And so let's think about this. Nearly half of humanity lacks the access to the abundant, reliable energy that we enjoy in most parts of the US. That's 3.6 billion people who may not have that. When we think about the kind of use of the energy and what's required, ending the energy poverty issue that we currently have requires 2,000 terawatt hours per year of new electricity, or that's 4 times Germany's current consumption. So as you say, doing that as business as usual with the coal-fired plants and that kind of generation, then we would end up really burning more than 4 times the proven reserves of what Saudi Arabia has by 2070. That's massive, and it's also very scary. And so we really have to focus on another way. And to your point of how can our international community come together to address it, and it really is leaning in to a clean energy revolution, if you can call it that, or a clean energy agenda that is really going to set the path differently for particularly low middle income of countries. And that's why the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet has come to be just a year old, launched at COP26 by 3 prominent philanthropic institutions, the Rockefeller Foundation, the IKEA Foundation, the Bezos Earth Fund, to find a new way of coming together as an alliance. It's almost comparable to what happened years ago with Gavi on the Alliance for Vaccinations and Immunizations, and now thinking through what is that model of doing it. And there are ambitious goals set out. How do we think about improving power for 1 billion people? In doing so, enabling the lives and livelihoods of 150 million people. How do we address even avoiding 4 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions? And those are huge, I recognize, ambitions and great goals, but it's really is what is needed. And so I think the question for us is the interesting part that we have now with philanthropic community coming together, and certainly Nima spoke to the Bridgetown Initiative, and I know the Rockefeller Foundation, along with several others, is very much a part of that. But thinking through what is that change in the MDB reform that's required so that those Bretton Woods institutions can not only bring forth additional financing for what it is that we need to do, helping to further decrease the costs of clean energy technologies for low and middle income countries, but also think through how they might be able to position it for better use of funds or for better use of proceeds. And that's where a platform like GIAP can come in that's really focusing on breakthrough solutions like battery storage, or thinking about aggregated procurement in some areas, or looking at the local currency questions that many of these developers who are working on solar mini grids and others are addressing. And so I think that is the opportunity of our time, Fritz, and thinking through what are platforms like this that actually can bring different voices, governments, the entrepreneurs, the private sector, development banks, DFIs and others, development finance institutions and others, to come together in a new way to really challenge business as usual. Yeah,
well, it really is all hands on deck, isn't it? And the magnitude of the challenge that both you and Nima painted is pretty daunting. So let's talk a little bit about the politics of this, and let me come to you, Lisa. You work a lot on social movements and the kind of grassroots politics of climate and advocacy for justice and climate justice, ecological justice. As you look at this, what are the obstacles to a more just response to climate change, but specifically to the kind of political mobilization that might be needed to demand that of our various institutions.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Fritz. What I'd like to do is actually answer your question by probably reframing it just a little bit.
You're welcome to do that.
Thank you. I think the obstacles are embedded in my response, kind of the flip side of what some of the opportunities are, I think, for how to have this more just response. I'd actually like to start by saying a little bit about the profession that I come from and the lens that I bring, because I think social work may be unfamiliar to some of our international affairs colleagues on the call, or maybe a limited area of social work is. Many people know social workers as therapists or human service workers. And yes, this is very much true. And social work is also very much a broad, diverse profession that's grounded in community needs. A very important part of that all hands on deck that was just mentioned is community itself. We're grounded in organizing in larger structural change. A social worker would bring a focus on the whole person, the context in which they live and are trying to navigate to survive and hopefully thrive. And so while climate change may not be a traditional area for a social work to engage in, it's really quite inseparable, at least in my mind. My own work, for example, focuses on mental health, physical health, financial impacts of climate change on people's everyday lives, and especially people who are the most minoritized by dominant society in whatever society we're talking about. I mean, I think an example, obvious example known to everybody here that brings some of these bigger, picture to life is around racist redlining in the US from 100 years ago, that now those very same neighborhoods are the ones that are, tying into Nima's statistics earlier, these are the neighborhoods that are most susceptible, have fewer trees, higher temperatures, worse air pollution, all of that. So we know these inequities are linked across environment and health. And so what do we do? What are the opportunities then, right? First, I think engaging with communities is so essential. Environmental and climate change are not new to the communities that are most affected. They're just not. And being marginalized and not listened to and excluded is also not new. And so we really need policymakers to more deeply shift how they think about and with communities themselves, and not just tokenizing a few members on commissions and committees. You mentioned folklore, right, as part of my background. What that's really about is lived experience of people's everyday wisdom and knowledge and experience that they share from generation to generation. And I think that's what we can tap into with communities as part of a more just response. Another area is, speaking to a group of mainly international affairs professionals, is I think the importance of actually focusing on local policy change as well. I'll give a quick example from Denver. 2 years ago, City of Denver passed a small sales tax increase. It generates $40 million annually for a climate protection fund. And our new Office of Climate Action, KASR, administers that fund, and it invests in both mitigation and adaptation locally. And part of the policy states it requires that 50% of the funds at least have to go directly to the communities in Denver that are most impacted by climate change. So that was codified in the policy itself. KASR takes that very seriously, of course. The Sustainability Advisory Council, it has many members on it. I'm no longer a member, but served in its initial founding, who are very focused on environmental and climate justice. And I think one reason that local policy like this matters is that it can improve not just conditions locally, but then provide examples for other cities and then on up the scales of policy change. I also think it can provide hope. Because I, for example, as a professor, have students who so often do have these feelings of anxiety, despair, immobilization around the climate crisis, around the political barriers being too big. And so I do encourage them to get local, to get involved, to take part and take action there. And then third, another opportunity is like we're doing today, I think, with who's on the panel and who's in the audience, is connecting the dots across issues. In the US, at least, I think, and I think there's data to, support this, climate change is actually less divisive now than it's often portrayed in popular media or sometimes in our own social media bubbles. We do have some recent surveys that show that at least 2 in 3 people in the US are somewhat worried about climate change. 7 in 10 have said that climate change was fairly or very serious. And so, thinking about where do we connect here? Are you a policy professional who focuses on education and kids? Well, guess what? Heat waves are shutting down public schools where they didn't before. It's disrupting learning, disrupting food access in schools when kids aren't going there, safety for children. So we have common ground on issues like that. Same thing with older adults, retirement, aging in place, and how older adults might be uniquely impacted by disasters and climate disasters. So I think climate change really isn't a siloed issue anymore. There's so much common ground where we can connect the dots and work together. So those are 3 of the opportunities I think.
That's great. Well, no, thank you very much for sharing that perspective and bringing us to the level of community, indeed, to putting a human face in some ways on the issue. Frank, you're probably the political scientist in this group, and maybe are looking at this at a somewhat more sort of global systems perspective. Clearly to meet we're going to blow past 1.5. Let's be honest. But to you come anywhere close to that target on the mitigation side, and let alone to do the kind of things that we probably almost certainly ought to be doing to help on the adaptation side, it's going to require systemic change. And so talk about, maybe if you could talk about the major systemic changes that you see that are needed if we're really to have a just and equitable response to climate change.
Thank you, Fritz. Yeah, and I think a lot of it has been illustrated by my fellow panelists as to how pervasive it is. We often think about climate change and we think about energy and oil and coal, and it tends to focus on machines and fuels and stuff like that. And that's all important, but all of those are connected in this very systemic way. So if we make big systemic changes to that configuration, those changes are going to be connected very strongly to the economy, to the society, to the political system. And so what we'll end up with is these ripple effects that go out from our efforts to address climate change. And they may land, I mean, some of them we can predict, but they may land in places we don't anticipate and raise a lot of serious equity and justice issues. There are a few of them that are staring us in the face. The most obvious is jobs, and there's a lot of concern now what happens in communities that depend very heavily on the coal industry for jobs, and those are communities that are often suffering a lot already economically, and when what jobs they have start going away even faster, what do you do about that? But the jobs are not just coal miners. It's everything from skilled trades, right? I mean, what happens to the pipe fitters when they don't have power plants and oil refineries to work on so much? To a lot of other job categories are probably not even thinking about right now. What will happen to those people? Where will those cuts go, and where will those benefits go? Land use. We're going to change the way we use land in all sorts of ways. Not only do we need to have physical changes to the land, but we need vastly more equitable ways of deciding what kinds of land uses go where, which is then kind of a part of this broader question of who bears the costs of these kinds of changes. There will be financial costs, there will be costs in the way people relate to their land and their local communities. There will be all sorts of things that we're probably not even thinking about right now. But I worry that those people, that marginalized people will suddenly find themselves beset by these problems, and that there will be pushback, and we've seen this a great deal already, trying to develop high voltage power transmission lines from areas with lots of wind or lots of solar or lots of hydro to high population areas. And so now we have encountered a whole series of resistance to those kinds of facilities. What kind of, and my view is that without some sort of equitable process for making those choices, that resistance will both, delay our ability to respond to climate change, but also end up pushing the facilities to the communities least able to resist them, which is not a very good way of making those kinds of decisions. So we need sort of an equitable and participatory, but also reasonably effective way of making the large scale changes to our systems that a new, for instance, energy system is going to need.
Well, as you talk, it reminds me that you and I are both involved in this conversation about the relationship between democracy and climate change, and the need for inclusive processes to make these kind of choices, these hard choices. If we're to have any hope of that, that the choices themselves are equitable. Wow, at the risk of, so there's a lot here, and at the risk of adding, piling on sort of on the problem side of things, I did want to raise, and I should say, some questions that were suggested by our students. So I want to give them credit for raising issues of concern to them. One of them was around climate refugees. And, of the many pathways through which climate change is going to affect our societies, we know changing weather patterns, drought, food insecurity are significant drivers already and are likely to be, I think, even bigger in the future. And I guess the question, and we could, anyone could pick this up, but, how big a problem is this likely to be? And what can we do to, both help and protect climate refugees, but also, perhaps to better prevent situations that create climate refugees in the first place? And I don't know, maybe, who would like to take that, whether it maybe Sundaa or Nima, if you have thoughts on that, maybe to get us started.
Sure, I'll just get us started. This is fortuitous because I spent the morning on a call with the World Bank on how do we address energy needs for refugees in Uganda, in particular, just as one place where I know that it's certainly the case for numbers. And so our great student noted climate refugees, but I think there are refugees generally who are suffering from the issues on not only from the impact of climate, but also from for other reasons, being displaced or in the situation where they are, and having to deal with lack of resources that are in some of these camps and communities to be able to support them. And I think that's part of the heart of the nexus piece, in terms of what I know is very critical in many of these communities is being able to have the energy resources for the proper lighting, for safety, for the proper provisions of water and food that are coming in, for allowing a sense of community in places. And so that's the angle in which we have been looking at these issues. And I think it's one where you think about the nexus of climate and agricultural development, for example, and some, where we need to spend a lot more attention in terms of the kinds of policies that need to be put in place from an energy transition perspective. And I don't mean that solely from the decommissioning or decarbonization perspective, but also thinking across the board in terms of access. But perhaps others may have thoughts as well.
Yeah, I don't know, Nima, do you have thoughts on this question?
I do. I come from a different place. I love Sunday's perspective on this. So I think my perspective is a little bit more. I worked at FEMA, and so when you work at FEMA, you're thinking about flood, hurricanes, tornadoes constantly, and what happens to those communities when those events occur, right? And so I think part of my thinking is we have to sort of start to really think much more strategically about who's going to be impacted and globally first, and at what point do you stop rebuilding? At what point is that not something that is viable anymore? When is it not an insurable risk, so to speak? And what happens to those countries? What happens to those people? And that is a really terrifying thought that no one really wants to get into yet, but you see it happening. We see it happening in the US in smaller increments, right? You see insurance companies pulling out of Florida because of the weather risks there. You see other areas, the rates have gone up so high, people can't afford to insure their homes and their properties, and certainly can't live there if they don't have insurance due to the threats. So there's this other dynamic occurring about sort of at what point can you no longer, is it not gonna be possible? At what point do you stop? And then what do you do? What do you do? I think this is the big question, and that time is coming before 2050, right? And a lot of people have these big goals out there, but that time is sort of going to be a big challenge, especially if you're a small island nation. And that's my biggest worry. That's why the Bridgetown Initiative to me is such a fascinating thing. It's such an amazing thing that that conversation was started, because they are an island nation and they are at risk and they know it and they're saying it. Very plainly, with not in a so give us something, but in a very pragmatic, hey, we're about to be on your doorstep, so you might want to avoid that by coming to the table before then. So, and
it's not just the island nations, obviously. I mean, you have in Bangladesh, a huge population living in a highly vulnerable situation, or the Mekong Delta, or many other regions facing that, and droughts in parts of Africa elsewhere that are threatening agriculture. We could go on, and I'm sure most of the audience knows. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we've never had so many refugees to begin with. I mean, the world we have refugees, an extraordinary number of refugees already. So our capacity to serve, to handle the volume that could be coming is something, as you say, we need to be, don't we, Nima?
Fritz, I'd like to add something here.
Of course, please.
Climate refugees, it's not my expertise, but there's some social aspects of this that are coming to mind for me. One around, related to Nima's points about, if there's a point in which you don't rebuild, what do you do? Then how do we, again, kind of, what is the opportunity, the role? What does it look like to take people's own preferences, choice, hopes around what happens next into account? And then also in the context of the US, which is where most of my work is these days, I don't have the magic wand for this. Somebody does, please tell me. But around, I don't even know if this is the right word, but receiving communities, maybe that's not the right phrase, but around if there just is this growing intolerance, hate, culture, context around that. And so how do we think proactively around that? And this is again where those connection points happen around cross-cultural acceptance, anticipating that people will be relocating.
I think that's a great issue, and we've seen other ways of migrants facing backlashes in communities where they have arrived. One could argue that Swedish politics have been radically changed by the influx of refugees into Sweden, just for example. So that seems a great point. Let me take another. I don't know, Frank, if you wanted to comment on this.
Just quickly, that in addition to refugees who cross borders, there will be a lot of people internally to within a country that need to move, including the U.S. And right now, if you want to sort of get people really angry, you talk about managed retreat. Can we actually manage a retreat of 30 or 50 million people from coastal areas, from areas in the West that are going to be increasingly prone to wildfires, where lots of very attractive environments are now actually becoming increasingly unviable because of climate change, and that how you pull that back is no simple matter.
Well, these are daunting problems. Go ahead. Yes. I was
just going to say, and to add to the point around who has, to Frank's point, who has the opportunity? It's forced moving is one, but the choice to move and then the resources to move where you want to move, and who doesn't, and who has to stay. And then concentration of further minoritization and lack of resources and disinvestment in that case. And we know that that's going to happen. We're anticipating that.
Yeah, well, it's a variant of the phenomenon that those most likely, most affected are often least able to respond and on their own. We go so many different directions. One, and maybe this reflects my own policy background, but looking at the pace with which the world is responding, or the United States is responding and dealing with any of these issues, it's we're not moving fast enough, and to me that's a political issue, a political will issue, and so. This is a question really posed by the students as well, as they wanted to ask, is it possible to create long-lasting, impactful climate policy under our current political system in which politicians are beholden to corporate donors with fossil fuel interests when their interests often diverge, well, from marginalized communities most affected by climate change. And at least in some ways, you were already talking about that. On the one hand, yes, communities can be resilient and take action into their own hands, but at the same time, marginalized communities are marginalized in the political process as well. And so I thought maybe you'd have maybe start us on that.
Sure, I think the phrase "under our current political system" is where my answer might be. I think my answer, again, more policy experts on here than me with international affairs, but under our current political system, I'm not too optimistic. But I would love to hear other panelists who have a more optimistic view and other ideas. I believe in we need more people who maybe historically haven't running for office and getting involved in the political system. So for me, that's where some of the opportunity is. And that can be sooner. It doesn't have to mean 20 years from now, right? So getting more people running for office, starting locally on up to other scales, just get involved, consider that as a route. I talk to social work students all the time about that. I also think, kind of related to this, having more, I don't know what it looks like, but training and ethics across some of these professions. You started us off talking about how this is a moral issue, right? So I think there's some overlaps there. I'd love to hear from others.
Yeah. What about on the international stage? Sundaa or Nima?
I have a thought. I wanted to just stick domestically for a second, though, because so over the past year, the Biden administration has passed two major bills. One is the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, and the second is the Inflation Reduction Act. So, so the combination of those two bills is about $1.5 trillion. So the IJA bill sort of lays the groundwork for infrastructure development. On top of that, then comes the IRA bill, right? So IRA is half a trillion dollars. So what's really, to me, very interesting about what's in the IRA is, let me start back. The goal of the IRA, the impact of the IRA, which has sort of been done analysis by the Repeat Project, not just administration or political thinking, but really a strong analysis. The goal of it is essentially to make clean energy cheaper than fossil fuel energy. That's the goal of it. And so how do they do this? They do this in a couple of different ways. One is by extending a significant amount of tax benefits. So there's tax benefits for coal, for clean hydrogen, for even nuclear, wind, solar, hydroelectric, 30%. If you're a nonprofit or public utility, you can get direct pay of that 30%. So you get the money instead of the tax benefit. You can also sell that tax benefit one time. So there will be a huge amount of investment into those energies. And in that, sort of utilities and public utilities and will need to be thinking about their energy mix. How will we do this? How much of each of these can we contribute while we try to maximize, right, the tax benefit, because they really want to to have the resources and the funding to them. So that's one piece of it. That's a huge amount of tax benefits. There's also a ton of money in there. So there's a greenhouse gas reduction fund for state and local governments. There's environmental justice block grants for state and local governments. There's funding for communities to monitor air pollutants and emissions. And these aren't small amounts. Like the greenhouse gas reduction fund is $27 billion. The block grant, the environmental justice block grant's $3 billion. There's money for schools to reduce air pollution, $50 million. And there's low emissions electricity programs. There's also a lot of funding in there for homes, for people to be able to weatherize their homes. There's money. So that impact will be fairly significant and felt over a 10-year period. It's only 10 years. Like, it's a lot of money to be distributing out over 10 years. And for the greenhouse gas reduction fund, there'll be some green banks or some room for innovation in there. The other really interesting piece to it is, so for example, if you're doing carbon capture, if you decide to do carbon capture technology and you use it to pump oil from the ground, you get a certain amount, because that was in the 2017 legislation. But if you decide to just store it, you get more. If you decide to do prevailing wage, you get more. If you have apprenticeships at a prevailing wage, right? So there is a tiering of that links back to people and that links back to communities, which I think is very different. And how they created the IRA was they did a lot of work with communities to sort of decide what the priorities were and try to get around the natural little tendencies, like you have a bill and there's like problems to it and you can't resolve them. They try to bring the business and communities into it. And the advent of Zoom really, really helped with that issue. So I think that with the IRA, though, there's this, like, I'm not an optimistic person generally, just as a personal stake in the ground, but I do feel that there is there is something happening here that will make a shift, because it's so much money. There will be a shift. And part of the prioritization in here was charging stations, right? Because of charging stations, if you can pull up online the charging station map of where the charging stations in the US are, and you can draw a line right through where they're not. And you can map those probably to those communities. The administration has put out a climate and environmental justice tool, so you can map over areas of the United States to see, where they're at risk for. And so, they're looking at this pretty much constantly. And what we're seeing at the state and local level is that a lot of the state and local governments have created environmental justice programs or offices. So they're getting there, right? Or they've gotten there because they know that this is happening. So that's my stake in the ground on this.
It's super helpful. I think most of us, most people aren't aware of quite the magnitude of what actually was passed in the last couple of years. It is extraordinary, and the extent to which those benefits are actually equitable and equally enjoyed, and dealing with the sort of inequitable climate justice questions we're talking about probably is not yet determined. But just quickly on this, and then I do want to turn to Q&A questions from all of you in the audience. But I did wonder, Sundaa, if you might comment on more from the international perspective on this question.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, because I think you have governments in Europe who are looking at the IRA and other policies and thinking carefully about what the needs might be in their own countries. But the whole the fortunate tragedy of Ukraine has upended a lot of thinking around energy security and the extension of what's taking place in Europe to what's happening in parts of the developing world. And so, they're not the same levels of policies like what's in IRA and elsewhere in parts of Africa, et cetera. But there is, I think, a very clear recognition that if energy poor countries escape energy poverty using fossil fuels, then the emissions will rise to become the majority of the global CO2 output by 2040. And so there needs to be a significant shift to avoid this. And so I think, to answer your question in particular, and to go back to something that Lisa said, it involves different kinds of coalitions. when I think about the work that we're doing in South Africa, for example, and helping to decommission a bit earlier a coal-fired power plant called Kamati in a town called Mpumalanga, and recognizing the impact that might have on some of the people who've been working at that, not only who've been working at the plant, but also those people who are in the area, and the impact that whole expedite of that process will have economically in terms of livelihoods in the area. And it requires thinking through what is that conversation with labor, with parts of the community, with leaders in the community, et cetera, with other people who may have prospects and opportunities for the next phase of, jobs and livelihoods in that work, if we were to think about that plant for renewable purposes, et cetera. And it requires different kinds of coalitions and discussions across the communities and governments about what to do next. And so at the moment, the focus really is on reskilling the population that's going to be most affected by this acceleration of decommissioning the plant. And it's not not the same kinds of detailed policies that are outlined in the IRA, but certainly getting governments to think differently, not only at the national levels, but at very local levels. What are those policies that need to be in place to be supportive of creating the safety nets that we know many of these communities will require?
It's interesting, the conversation it's gravitated to national policy, subnational community levels. And it sort of calls into question the efficacy of the international processes that we've put in place. We had a brief mention earlier of the COP talks in Egypt. Greta Thunberg, made headlines last year saying, well, first of all, blah, 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 and then, called them greenwashing, and so there's not really meant to actually do, change the system. And so the international policy person in me, wonders whether the institutions we have at the global level are doing the kind of things that need to be done to have the kind of inclusive conversations that and multi-stakeholder fora that you were describing. And I thought maybe Frank, I don't know if you have a comment on that from a kind of, as our political scientist here in the panel, are these international processes sort of somehow, I don't know what the right word is, irrelevant or disconnected or inadequate for the task at hand?
All of the above. I think more they're kind of bogged down in a model that doesn't work very well of what they actually can do and what they can't do. And that's, the sort of things that Sundaa was talking about in South Africa. How do you facilitate and make possible more of those local, regional kinds of initiatives that can make a real tangible difference on the ground? Mm-hmm. And there's so much effort in the current COP system. Don't mean the acronyms. There's so much emphasis in the current climate negotiations on these much more top-down, kind of almost regulatory type policies that don't really have any meaning in the international level. And so I'm concerned that however well-intentioned, I don't share Greta Thunberg's view that everyone there just doesn't care and they're all in the pocket of the fossil fuel industry. A lot of them do care, but they're in a system, in a model, and utilizing a model that doesn't actually work very well for the problem at hand. And I think that it's not that I would abolish them, but I think they need a substantial change in direction.
Yeah. Well, let me turn to a question. Thank you, Frank, and thank you all of you. Great conversation here. Let me turn to some of the questions from our audience, and I will just I'm probably need my glasses here to read these on my screen here. So one question is really, what can we do, if anything, in our personal lives to have the most positive impact on global warming, climate control? the questioner asked, you read a lot about huge footprint of manufacturing, a footprint to manufacture electric cars, and they're generating colossal carbon dioxide emissions, also for that matter, extractive industry problems, which they also, the environmental damage of lithium extraction. So the general question, though, is one of what we should be doing in our personal lives. Thoughts?
Protesting. Like all the time.
Yeah. So you're thinking, so your answer is more of a political answer, as protesting and asking for what?
I think it depends on how you look at it, because I think of protesting as like personal, but
oh, okay. Well,
it's like it's very much a staple in our household. But I do think that there needs to be, so Gen Z, which I think is probably a good part of this audience, students really have a unique opportunity to make themselves known. They are the largest and most diverse generation, but their numbers speak, right? If you're Gen X, which I am, you have one of the smallest generations, and so you didn't have so much of a cultural resonance. And so, but Gen Z is a different ballgame altogether. And so, look, I mean, I work on the corporate side. I also work with the governments on state, local governments on climate issues. And on the corporate side, they're aware. People are aware. Gen Z's voice is big, and they need to make themselves known as much as possible. And so, as consumers, as protesters, as people who can affect change, who will be leading in a few years, they'll be the ones in charge. So, start now.
Fritz, I just wanted to say, I live in a household where, we have a 16-year-old daughter, and she used to come home, with, I remember years ago, with the composting piece. And so we're composting, right? And then we decide to get solar panels on our home. And now we're doing the solar panels piece. Now there's a conversation around, should we get an electric vehicle and being able to move towards that? I think there are those discussions as a family, but maybe not protesting, which I think is important that Nima noted, but I do think there is an engagement at the local level that needs to happen for every family. My husband sits on the open space committee in our township, very much involved in birding, actually, and the impact of, some of what's happening in our region of New Jersey, central New Jersey, on some of the species that are here, those kinds of things. I think we need to show up at those open space committee meetings and those conversations that are taking place about what's happening to farmlands around our homes and where we work and play and our children go to school. I think that sense of activism that has been at the heart of America's citizenry, I think, coming back to that and really being more engaged in that at the very local level. It's the same kind of activity that we were talking about, what we want to see when we're in other countries, right? And how do we engage with those leaders in other countries? For those of us who really deeply care about the issues, make a difference at home, just as you're trying to. For me, I can say it to myself, just as I'm trying to make a difference and be supportive of other people's ability to make a difference in their own home. And so I think that's a really key part of our exercise. I wanted to make one last comment on this, because I think about it a lot as a student of international development, a lifelong one. Eleanor Ostrom has always been a key kind of guiding figure for me. And as we all know, she's, won a Nobel Prize economist and been thinking a lot, had been, really huge in contributing to how development should take forward. And the whole participatory nature of it, the things that Lisa was saying, is so critical to the way that I think progress, no matter what one calls it, in developing world, et cetera, should happen the listening part, the bringing people together to understand what the challenges are, the whole notion that some say nothing for us, nothing, for us without us kind of thing. Mm-hmm. That conversation needs to be at the heart of it. And I keep going back to that. And I think that it's so easy to allow some of this work, whether at home or abroad, to be, let me just call it, industrialized, and for it not to have that sense of touch and being closer to the ground and communities. And I think that's what we need to fight against is how do we think much more, I think, fundamentally and maybe 101 about what it means to be a part of a community and engaging in that community.
Yeah. Lovely. A lot of conversation, which I love, around community and engaging close to home. A couple of questions here, comments around on the refugee question. One, a comment from my colleague Rebecca Galemba, who notes that 80% of refugees are hosted in developing countries. Climate refugees often end up just close by and unable to move, or in places just as vulnerable. We may be imagining somehow that they're coming here or elsewhere. And another just general question: what is the world doing to support environmental refugees? Again, I'm who might want to take that question. I don't know whether, I guess it's a global kind of question, so I'm going to pick on either Sundaa or Nima to take that.
I wish I knew, I'm going to be straightforward and say, I wish I knew the answer in terms of what the world is doing, generally speaking. Clearly, we're not doing enough. I do think that there are great resources in the International Rescue Committee or other places where colleagues could gain a bit more insight on what is happening in this context. And to Frank's point, there are the refugees, and there are others who are displaced internally, et cetera. And I think we need to think about the whole gamut of it and try to figure out how do we address these issues from that perspective. I think it is an interesting one where that it's not been at the heart of these COP conversations. And to Nima's point, 27 was about loss and damage and or a few other things, and not about this. And so I think our colleagues who are asking these questions is very much pointing to the need to shine a light on it, and for all of us to gain additional insights on what needs to be supportive in that regard.
Yeah. We should pull Rebecca into this conversation. She writes quite a bit on these issues. Another question, different tact. This is, will insurance companies simply reactively stop insuring as the risks get too high? And will they also proactively contribute money or work to solve the climate issues? What is likely to happen? I think we've already mentioned that insurance companies are beginning to not insure in various places. And thoughts about the role of insurance companies in this whole picture?
I mean, insurance is sort of the front line, right, of how one can recover from a major climate disaster, is that you have insurance. That's the only way really to recover. And so insurance companies, I think they run the gamut in how they're thinking about this. It's a very interesting thing. I mean, some are really thinking, okay, we're here, we're going to help you prepare for tomorrow. And others are thinking, okay, that's too high of a risk and we can't make it work with the state regulator. And so we for various reasons, we can't stay, right? We need to raise our rate. It's a profit-driven business. They need to be able to have their rates be commensurate to the risk. And oftentimes, and insurance in the US, insurance in the US is regulated on a state-by-state basis. So if you're an insurance company, you need to go to each state Department of Insurance and get, your rates approved. And so if you have a state that says, okay, your rates are really, your risk is really, really high for wildfires, but we're not going to let you raise your rates. Those insurance companies also then have the option of saying, we can't be here. And so I think that's part of the challenge that any business is going to have. And there's going to be an adjustment period of figuring out exactly how you're going to operate. And there's also insurance and there's reinsurers, which insure the insurers. And so they're also facing these challenges, right? Because it's expensive. $347 billion, $1 billion in losses is a lot of money to insure, and it's going to be challenging. So it's, to me, the insurance landscape is just a fascinating one, because on one hand, they're on the front line of this, they're a business, it's almost like they're sort of trying to figure this out as well. How do we manage this? Now, in the US and in Europe, so one thing we didn't talk about was sort of how regulation is sort of playing in. And in the US, we have a couple of things happening. We have a couple of things happening from the regulatory front. First of all, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, has released a draft climate disclosure rule. They did release that last year in March. That final rule is due to come out in sometime first half of this year. That rule is requiring publicly traded companies to have huge disclosures on their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, so greenhouse gas emissions, their risks, how they're managing that, what their process is for managing it, what they basically, what will be the impact of the climate on their business, how are they going to be managing this? So the disclosures are significant as currently written, and it will be public, right? So it will be in their management reports. They need to be publicly stating what they're doing. If they make a big net zero commitment, then they need to be talking about how they're going to be meeting that net zero commitment. So it sort of X's out the greenwashing piece, which has been happening, I think, across the board. But companies are really starting to think of. In Europe, CSRD just passed, which is a climate sustainability directive. And that goes further than climate. And it also talks about the social piece, right? And so that just passed for its tiering of who has to respond to it by when, but they think that the number of companies responding to it will go from 12,000 to 50,000 over the next few years. Mm-hmm. It'll be pretty significant requirements for disclosures. And Europe does not play, right? They did GDPR. Now we all have this, accepting all the cookies on our websites, because they're essentially regulating us to a certain extent. So they're putting that into place. The other thing that's come up recently is the carbon border adjustment mechanism in Europe. So that will come into play, I think, October of this year, where all companies, the importers in Europe, have to will be taxed on the carbon of their imports, right? So if they're importing steel from the US, that importer will be paying a tax on the amount of carbon that steel producer in the US emits. And they have, the steel producer in the US and any other country, exporting to Europe, will have to disclose that to Europe. And so that's coming into play. So that will have a knock-on effect of companies really trying to reduce their emissions, because then they won't be the ones that Europe wants to import from. If you're a high producing, a high emitting industry in particular, it starts out with the high emitters, cement, steel, electricity. They will be required to then, there's an incentive in there, right, to reduce their emissions. So these things are sort of happening across the board. There's many more things happening in the US. The financial regulators back to insurance are really starting to think about scenario analysis for banks and also for insurance companies. The states are requiring them to produce a climate survey. So 15 states have signed on to this. You can see it on the websites. You can see what the insurance companies are saying. So
yeah. Our time is now running short. Just quickly, one more that quite related to the point you were making, though, around ESG. Mm-hmm. And really, it's about the extent to which, let's call them more voluntary programs, the ESG, interact with the regulatory environment. But there's been a huge focus on ESG, and then now kind of a backlash in some quarters, questioning whether it's greenwashing on the one hand or whether it should be done at all. I guess the question is, whether we have ideas about how do we bring more credibility to ESG programs. And Nima, you've already addressed in some ways that issue in the sense of more regulatory structures that create incentives that go beyond the voluntary. But I don't know, Frank, if you have thoughts on that or
None that I would add to some of the things Nima could say. Sometimes though, I mean, ESG, I don't know how well it works, but I was more thinking about the insurance question. Do you sort of align companies' incentives with dealing with climate change? And, you know, even when there was a lot of noise being made by climate deniers that there was no climate change, the European reinsurance companies especially had these websites that said, no, this is real, it's huge, it's going to cream us, you know, because they were insuring $100 million resorts on the beach that were going to get washed away. Yeah, I'm not the person to ask about ESG, but I do think that sort of just that fairly simple aligning of economic interests with dealing with climate change gets those firms' attention.
Yeah, I could probably answer it a little bit. It's just in my own work, I've done some work on this, and I've come down firmly in the middle on the question, which is to say, on the one hand, it's ESG or CSR programs, or they're not nothing by any means. They work better in some circumstances than others, particularly when you have consumer-facing industries where there's the potential for backlash or pressure coming from consumers, but work less well in other settings. But at the end of the day, and this I think was a point Nima was making, that regulatory measures are probably needed, and to really create the kind of incentives we want. Well, we are really close to time. What I want to do is just give each of you a moment just to add any thoughts you might have, things we might have missed, or comments that you'd like to make about the conversation we've had, and maybe we'll I don't know which order to go in. We'll go in reverse order of what we started, I think. So maybe I'll start with Frank, and then Lisa, Sundaa, and Nima.
Okay, thank you. I think part of this conversation makes the point I was going to make, which is that there's a very broad range of groups of people who will be affected both by climate change and by policies that seek to address climate change. And I think we have to think very broadly and be fully prepared for the idea that organizations, groups, localities will present us with equity and climate justice problems that we're not even thinking about now, but we need to have that listening capacity to see it when it happens.
Thanks. Lisa, your thoughts?
Yeah, my synthesis would be, keep talking about this, keep talking about climate change and connecting these dots across issues for yourself and in your conversations with others. Community has been a big theme today, which I love, looking for the unusual allies, building the coalitions, and then really the importance of starting where you are, taking action. It all matters. There is a Mariama Kaba quote that I love to share. For the sake of time, I'll shorten it, but I would like to still read part of it. Mariama Kaba writes, "Changing everything might sound daunting, but it also means there are many places to start, infinite opportunities to collaborate, and endless imaginative interventions and experiments to create. Boundless possibilities of a more just world await us."
Oh, lovely. Lovely quote. Thank you. Sundaa.
That is lovely and really hard to come after when you have someone who says such wonderful and beautiful things that are so critical and important. May I add a quote that maybe is on the opposite end, which is, I heard a colleague say, how do we make 1 + 1 not equal 2, but 1 + 1 = 11? We're just speaking to the point of bringing the coalitions of people together and finding a way to make our efforts really build across to more transformational, impactful efforts. And that's certainly, been the case for where I am now at the Global Energy Alliance, where we have a number of partners across the sectors that I had previously mentioned, and are really trying to leverage the philanthropic capital to get more climate finance that's available to drive forward on a clean energy agenda. So join us.
A great invitation. Thank you. Nima.
Yes. I have a daughter who's in college. And so when I thought about this, I for the students who are watching in particular, so that's where my heart is in this, which is to say that you have a lot more power and leverage than you think. learn everything you can possibly learn, and come out into the world and take it by storm, because we need you. So.
Wonderful words of advice, and thank you so much, all of our wonderful panelists, for giving your time and thoughts today. Really a wonderful discussion. Too short, always too short, but as was said, we need to keep having these conversations. So look forward to the next one, and let me thank everyone, all of you in the audience, for joining us today. Stay tuned for our next ICAP conversation. We will be announcing that soon, and look forward to seeing you or having you attend that as well. Anyway, thank you all again very much for a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Right.